There are some moments in life that never leave you, even if they pass in silence, and this story begins with one of those moments. It happened years ago, on a quiet afternoon when the sun hung low enough to cast long shadows across the studio lot. Keanu Reeves stood alone near the back entrance, hands in his pockets, waiting for Sandra Bullock, while rehearsing words he had been carrying inside for far too long. He didn't know it then, but the decision he made in those few minutes would change everything between them, even if neither dared to speak openly about it. And if you listen closely to this story, you might feel the same tension he felt that day, the weight of a truth too heavy to say aloud, yet too powerful to ignore. Keanu had always been calm on the surface, the kind of person who could stand completely still while the whole world rushed around him, but inside he felt something burning and restless. He kept replaying the same questions over and over. Should he finally tell her what he felt, or should he keep it buried, safe from the risk of breaking something precious? He already knew what most people didn't: that silence could protect you, but it could also haunt you, especially when you weren't sure if you were guarding your heart or running from it. He stared at the ground, breathing slowly, trying to steady himself. Even though he was known for humility and patience, this moment shook him in a way he wasn't prepared for. Sandra was late, but not in a careless way. She had always moved through life with energy, kindness, and a kind of unstoppable warmth that made everyone around her feel seen. The crew said her laugh could soften even the worst day, and her sincerity made her stand out in an industry full of masks. She never pretended to be someone she wasn't, and that honesty was exactly what made Keanu's secret so hard to carry. He respected her too much, admired her too deeply, and he feared that if he ever spoke the truth, the world they had built together, a world of trust, ease, inside jokes, and quiet moments, might crumble into something neither of them could repair. When she finally appeared, walking toward him with her coffee in hand and sunlight catching in her hair, he almost forgot how to breathe. She greeted him with that familiar smile, the one that was never forced, never polite, but real, warm, and full of life. She said his name in that gentle tone she always used with him, a tone that made him feel grounded no matter what was happening around them. But that day, her voice made his chest tighten with something he had tried to ignore for months. He felt the urge rise stronger than ever, the urge to confess everything. Yet he pushed it down again, unsure if he was strong enough to risk losing her. They walked together toward the rehearsal room, and at first everything felt normal. There were jokes, light teasing, and the kind of comfort that comes from knowing someone deeply and trusting them without reservation. But underneath all of it, Keanu's thoughts kept drifting back to what he almost said moments before she arrived. He wondered if she sensed the tension building in him, if she noticed how his smile felt a little tighter, or how his silences lasted a little longer. Sandra had always been perceptive, sometimes more than she let on, and sometimes her kindness revealed truths she never said aloud. But today, she looked at him with a slightly puzzled expression, as if she sensed something shifting but couldn't name it yet. As they sat down for the read-through, Keanu found himself watching her more than the script. He studied the way she listened to others, the way she leaned in when someone spoke, the way she encouraged nervous crew members with a soft touch on the shoulder or a quiet word. He admired how she treated people, not because she wanted to be liked, not because she needed approval, but because she believed deeply in kindness. It reminded him of one of the reasons he cared for her so much. She had a way of lifting others without ever needing to stand on a pedestal herself. She led with compassion, not ego, and that made her feel rare in a world where so many were fighting to be noticed. At one point, Sandra turned to Keanu and asked if he was feeling all right. Her eyes lingered a little too long, gently searching his expression, trying to read the emotions he was so desperately trying to hide. He gave a small nod, but she tilted her head slightly, sensing there was more beneath the surface. She didn't push, though. She respected boundaries. She always had. She simply gave him a quiet look that said, "I'm here if you need me," the kind of unspoken support that made Keanu's resolve weaken for just a moment. During a break, they wandered outside again, where the breeze carried the faint scent of pine and warm pavement. Sandra sipped her coffee and leaned against the railing, looking out at the busy lot. She asked him what was on his mind, her tone gentle but curious. He paused, feeling his heart beat loudly against his ribs. This was the moment he could have told her everything. All he had to do was say the words, just a few simple sentences, but he hesitated. Not because he doubted his feelings, but because he cared too much about hers. He didn't want to disrupt her peace. He didn't want to complicate her world with the weight of his emotions. So he said nothing. Instead, he talked about work, about schedules, about the future of the project. And Sandra listened, nodding slowly, but something in her expression softened, almost like she sensed the edges of an unspoken truth pressing against both of them. She didn't say anything about it, but her eyes held a quiet understanding, as if she was waiting for him to take the first step. She had always respected that it wasn't her place to drag the truth out of someone, even when she sensed exactly what it was. When they returned inside for the next rehearsal, the tension between them felt slightly different. Not uncomfortable, not strained, but charged in a way that neither could ignore. Small glances lasted a little longer. Small smiles carried a little more weight. There was a subtle shift, a deep emotional current running beneath their usual rhythm. And despite all his efforts to hide it, Keanu knew she could feel it too. Something was changing, something neither of them had planned for, and the only question left was whether they were ready to face it. But this day had one more turn, one moment neither of them expected, because as they were gathering their things to leave, a crew assistant rushed in with news that would change the entire course of their week and maybe their lives. Sandra's expression went still. Keanu's breath caught. The room fell silent for a brief but heavy moment, the kind that seemed to stretch on forever. And when the assistant finally explained what had happened, everything inside both of them shifted again, in a direction neither of them saw coming. The room felt too quiet after the assistant finished speaking, as if every sound around them had been swallowed by the weight of that single message. Sandra froze, her fingers still curled around the strap of her bag, while Keanu took a slow step toward her, unsure whether to speak or give her space. The assistant, still slightly out of breath, held out a folded note, explaining that someone had come by the studio urgently, insisting it was for Sandra and that she needed to read it immediately. The assistant added that the visitor seemed nervous, almost shaken, and left the moment the message was delivered. Then they hurried out again, leaving an awkward silence behind, as though they wanted no part of whatever storm this note was about to bring. Sandra reached for the paper with careful hands. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes narrowing as she read the first lines. Keanu watched the shift in her expression, the confusion, the growing concern, and then something deeper, something that made her shoulders tense as though the world had suddenly pressed down on her. He had seen her handle difficult situations before, had seen her stay calm even when everything else was falling apart, but this was different. There was something in her silence that unsettled him. He stepped closer, speaking her name softly, but she didn't respond at first. Instead, she read the note again, as if trying to make sense of words that didn't seem real. When she finally lowered the paper, her eyes met Keanu's, and the fear in them made his chest tighten. She handed him the note without a word, and he took it carefully, feeling the thin paper tremble slightly in her hand before it left her fingers. The message was short, only a few lines written in hurried strokes. It said someone from her past was trying to reach her, someone who knew something important about an event she had never talked about publicly. The note didn't explain what the information was, only that it was urgent, and that she needed to meet them before the end of the week. There was no name, no signature, only a time and a location scribbled at the bottom. It felt mysterious, almost unsettling, and Keanu felt his stomach sink as he finished reading it. He handed the paper back slowly and watched as Sandra folded it with trembling fingers. He asked her gently if she knew who it might be, but she didn't answer right away. She looked down, breathing slowly, as if steadying herself before speaking. When she finally did, her voice was quiet, almost fragile. She said she wasn't sure, but there was someone she hadn't thought about in years, someone she hoped she would never have to face again. Someone who knew too much about a part of her life she had buried, because remembering it felt like reopening an old wound. Keanu didn't push for details. He knew better than to force someone to reveal pain before they were ready. Instead, he stepped beside her and stood silently, offering support without pressure. That was one of the things Sandra valued most about him. He understood the power of patience, the importance of giving others room to breathe. But she also knew he would be there the moment she decided she couldn't hold the weight alone. They walked outside together, leaving the rehearsal room behind. The sun had dipped even lower, painting the lot in muted gold and long shadows. The air felt thick with worry. Sandra kept glancing at the paper in her hand, her mind clearly racing, while Keanu stayed close enough to make her feel safe without crowding her. The walk to the parking area felt longer than usual, stretched by the tension neither of them dared to break. When they reached her car, Sandra finally spoke again. She said there was a part of her past she never wanted to revisit, one that reminded her of a time when she had trusted the wrong people and paid the price quietly so no one else would get involved. She didn't explain everything, but her voice revealed enough for Keanu to understand that whatever was coming was something she had fought hard to forget. She told him she didn't want anyone else dragged into it, especially him. But Keanu shook his head gently. He told her that she wasn't alone, not now, not ever, not if she didn't want to be. He told her that facing the past was never easy, but doing it alone made it twice as painful. He said that kindness wasn't just about helping strangers. It was also about standing with the people you cared about, even when the path ahead was unclear. His voice was calm, soft, and steady, the kind of voice that felt like an anchor during storms. Sandra looked at him then, really looked at him, as if searching for a reason to refuse his offer. But she didn't find one. She felt the sincerity in his words, the quiet strength behind them, and it softened something inside her. She touched his arm lightly, not as a gesture of weakness, but of gratitude. She said she would tell him everything soon, once she gathered the courage to reopen a chapter she thought she had closed forever. Keanu nodded, accepting her timeline without question. Then, before either of them could say more, Sandra's phone buzzed sharply. She jumped slightly, startled by the sudden noise after so many heavy silences. When she checked the screen, her eyes widened. She showed it to Keanu without a word. It was a message from an unknown number. The text said only one sentence, but it was enough to send a chill through both of them. "You shouldn't have ignored the first warning." Sandra's breath caught. Keanu stepped closer, tension rising in him. He asked her calmly if she had received any warning before today, but she shook her head. No note, no call, no message. Nothing. Which meant whoever sent this message knew exactly where she was, what she was doing, and how to reach her. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. Keanu looked around the parking lot slowly, scanning the cars, the shadows, the small movements in the distance. Sandra swallowed hard, gripping her phone as if it might slip from her hands. Something was happening, something she had spent years avoiding, and now it was back, closer than she imagined. And neither of them knew what would happen next. But just as Keanu reached out to steady her, Sandra's phone buzzed again. Another message. This time, it was even worse. The second message appeared on Sandra's screen so quickly that it almost felt like whoever sent it was watching her closely, waiting for the exact moment she let fear settle into her eyes. She hesitated before opening it, her hand shaking slightly. Keanu stepped closer, not touching her, but close enough for her to feel his presence, the quiet strength he offered without needing to say a word. She finally tapped the notification, and the screen lit up with a short line that made her breath falter. "Meet me, you owe me the truth." It was simple, but the weight of it struck her like a sudden cold wind. She took a step back, as if distance could somehow soften the message. Keanu's expression darkened with concern as he read over her shoulder. He spoke her name again, gently, trying to anchor her before her thoughts spiraled. She blinked several times, as if trying to clear a heavy fog settling behind her eyes, and then looked up at him with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. She whispered that she didn't owe anyone anything from that part of her life, not anymore. But even as she said it, doubt crept into her voice, leaving a fragile crack in her resolve. There was something in the way the message was worded, something personal, something that suggested whoever sent it knew details no stranger should know. Keanu noticed the shift in her expression and asked softly if she recognized the tone, the phrasing, anything at all. She swallowed hard and said she wasn't sure, but it felt uncomfortably familiar, like hearing a voice she thought she would never hear again. For a moment they stood there in silence, the late afternoon breeze brushing past them, carrying the scent of asphalt and fading sunlight. Around them the lot buzzed with movement, crew members carrying equipment, people heading home, cars pulling out one by one, but inside their small corner of the world, everything felt suspended. Sandra's heart pounded too loudly in her chest. Keanu's jaw tightened, the only visible sign that he was fighting the urge to act before they had enough information. Finally, Sandra took a deep breath and said she needed to go home. She needed to think, to gather her thoughts before every memory from her past came crashing back at once. Keanu nodded immediately, offering to follow her in his own car to make sure she arrived safely. She hesitated, not wanting to involve him further, but he insisted gently, reminding her that no one should face fear alone. Reluctantly, she agreed. They walked to their cars, the air thick with tension. Sandra pulled out of the lot first, and Keanu followed a careful distance behind, watching the road, watching the shadows between the streetlights, watching everything. His instincts buzzed with unease, something deeper than worry, something protective. He wasn't sure what danger she was facing, but he knew she wasn't imagining it. Whoever was contacting her had been waiting for the right moment, and now that moment had arrived. When they reached Sandra's home, she invited him inside. She didn't want to be alone with the thoughts swirling in her mind. The living room felt strangely quiet when she walked in, as if the familiar space had shifted into a place where old memories could suddenly breathe again. She placed the folded note on the coffee table and stared at it as though it were alive, pulsing with secrets she wasn't ready to uncover. Keanu sat on the edge of the sofa, giving her the space to pace as she needed. She moved back and forth across the room, her steps quick and restless, her hands moving in small, nervous gestures. After several minutes, she stopped, looked at him, and finally began to speak. She told him there was a time early in her career when she had fallen into a friendship that seemed harmless at first, someone who praised her, supported her, and seemed genuinely invested in her success. Someone who said all the right things, but slowly things changed. The person became possessive, controlling, and eventually manipulative. They tried to steer her decisions, manage her relationships, and isolate her from people who genuinely cared. She said she had never told the full story publicly because she didn't want to turn someone else's mistakes into entertainment or gossip. She didn't want sympathy, and she didn't want to reopen old wounds. She simply walked away from the situation as quietly as possible and tried to rebuild her peace. But now she continued, her voice trembling. It seemed like that past wasn't finished with her. Keanu listened, his brows pulling together in quiet frustration, not at her but for her. He couldn't understand why someone would resurface now after so many years and with such cryptic messages. He asked her gently if this person had ever threatened her directly. She shook her head, saying no, not physically, but psychologically, yes. Their presence had been enough to create a constant sense of unease, a pressure she carried even after cutting ties. Just as she finished speaking, her phone buzzed again. The sound sliced through the quiet like a sharp blade. Sandra flinched, and Keanu stood up instinctively, ready to face whatever was coming next. She hesitated before picking up the device, fear rippling through her expression. When she read the message, her breath left her body in a shaky exhale. She handed the phone to Keanu with a hand so unsteady, he reached out to steady her wrist instinctively. The message read, "You can't hide from what happened. Meet me tomorrow. I already know he is with you." Keanu's stomach tightened as he read it. The message wasn't just about Sandra anymore. Somehow, whoever sent it knew Keanu was there. Knew they had left the studio at the same time. Knew they had arrived at her home together. Someone was watching. Keanu lifted his head slowly, scanning the windows, the quiet street outside, the shadows stretching across the garden. His voice stayed calm, but there was a steel edge beneath it when he told Sandra they needed to take this seriously. Very seriously. She nodded, fear settling heavier in her eyes, because deep down she already knew. Then her phone buzzed again. But this time it wasn't a message. It was a call. From an unknown number. The same number. She stared at the screen, frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. Keanu stepped closer, waiting for her to decide. And just as she reached for the phone to answer it, everything in the house went dark. The lights, the TV, the lamps, everything. The power had gone out, the darkness in the room. The sudden blackout fell over the house like a heavy curtain, swallowing every familiar shape and replacing it with shadow. Sandra gasped, her breath catching in her throat as the phone slipped from her hand and landed on the carpet with a soft thud. Keanu reached out instinctively, steadying her before she stumbled back. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence felt wrong, too deep, too deliberate, the kind of quiet that made a person feel watched even when they were alone. Keanu whispered her name, his voice steady despite the tension gripping the room. He told her to stay close. Sandra nodded, barely able to see him in the darkness but grateful for his calm presence. Her heartbeat raced so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She whispered that the power almost never went out in her neighborhood, not like this, not without warning. And Keanu understood what she was thinking even before she said it. This didn't feel like an accident. They stood in silence for a few seconds, waiting for the lights to flicker back on, but nothing happened. The darkness held its ground. Keanu reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and turned on the flashlight. The small circle of light pushed back the dark just enough for them to see each other's silhouettes. Sandra's eyes reflected the shaky glow, full of fear she could no longer hide. Keanu picked up the phone from the floor. The screen still glowed with the incoming call notification, the unknown number pulsing like a heartbeat in the dark. He showed it to her and asked quietly if she wanted him to answer. Sandra swallowed hard, and after a moment nodded. Her hands trembled, so Keanu pressed the answer button for her and put the phone on speaker, holding it between them as the room stayed shrouded in silence. At first, there was nothing, no voice, no breath, no sound at all, just a soft static that made the moment feel colder. Sandra leaned closer, her eyes fixed on the screen as if trying to read the silence. Then finally, a voice came through. Low, controlled, too calm. The voice said her name slowly, almost tenderly, in a way that made Sandra's entire body stiffen. She knew that tone. She knew that cadence. It was like hearing a ghost from a life she had tried to forget. Keanu watched her carefully, seeing the fear settle deeper in her chest. The voice continued, saying he had waited long enough, that Sandra had run from their unfinished conversation for years. He said he wasn't angry, just disappointed that she thought she could erase the past without consequences. Then he mentioned something that made Keanu's blood run cold. He said he had already seen her leave the studio today. He said she looked different now, more cautious, more guarded. He said she should have taken the first note seriously. Sandra's eyes widened as she realized what that meant. He had been close enough to watch her in person, close enough to know her movements, close enough to know she had company. Then, almost casually, the voice said he recognized Keanu's car. He said Keanu was kind to follow her home. He said kindness was a rare quality in their world, but sometimes kindness made people vulnerable. Keanu's hand tightened around the phone, his jaw clenched but his voice steady when he asked, very calmly, who the caller was and what he wanted. But the voice didn't answer him. Instead, it continued speaking to Sandra, as if Keanu wasn't even there. The caller said he knew something about a decision she made long ago, a decision she thought no one else knew about, something she had done to protect someone, something she believed had stayed buried all these years. Sandra shook her head softly, whispering that he was twisting the truth. Keanu whispered back that she didn't have to answer, not yet. But the caller wasn't finished. He said he had evidence, proof that could tear apart everything she had built. He said he didn't want to ruin her life. He just wanted her to remember, to admit what happened, to meet him tomorrow at the time and place he had written on the note. And then, in a quieter tone that made Sandra's skin crawl, he said she knew exactly why she needed to be there. Keanu took a step forward, as if confronting the very voice in the phone, and asked again who the caller was. This time the voice paused. The silence stretched so long that Sandra thought the call had dropped. Then the voice returned, softer and almost amused. "You already know who I am," he said. "You just hoped I had disappeared." Sandra covered her mouth, her breath shaking as tears welled up. Keanu stepped beside her, but before either of them could speak again, the line clicked and the call ended. The phone screen went dark, leaving them in the dim glow of the flashlight. For several seconds they stood frozen, listening to the quiet house around them. The darkness felt thicker now, not just a loss of lights, but a presence pressing in from every corner. Keanu walked to the nearest window and peeked out carefully, his movements deliberate. The street outside was dim, but not completely dark. Only Sandra's house had lost power. That confirmed it. Someone had cut the electricity. Sandra's voice broke as she whispered that she didn't know what to do. Keanu placed his hand gently on her shoulder, grounding her. He told her that they were going to take this step by step, that fear was loud but not stronger than truth, and she didn't have to face any of this alone. Sandra took a shaky breath, trying to believe him, trying to hold onto the strength he offered. Before she could speak again, a soft tapping sound echoed from the back of the house. 3 taps. Slow. Measured. Intentional. Keanu turned immediately toward the hallway, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Sandra clutched his arm, her nails digging in slightly. The tapping continued. Tap. 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 And then it stopped. Keanu whispered for her to stay behind him as he moved silently toward the sound, each step careful, calculated, his eyes scanning every shadow. Sandra stayed close, unable to stand still but terrified to move without him. They reached the end of the hallway, both holding their breath. And then from the other side of the house, a different sound echoed, a door clicking softly, as if someone had just entered. And Sandra whispered one word under her breath, so faint Keanu barely heard it. No, the soft click echoed through the house like a whispered threat, quiet enough to be missed by anyone not already trapped in fear, but sharp enough to send a cold shock down Sandra's spine. She gripped Keanu's arm tighter, her fingers trembling, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. Keanu turned toward the sound, his jaw tightening as the beam of his phone's light swept slowly across the dark hallway. Every corner felt alive, Every shadow felt heavier, as if the darkness itself was holding its breath, waiting. For a moment, neither of them moved. They stood completely still, listening. The silence was thick, dense, almost suffocating. Sandra whispered again that the door should not have made that sound. All her doors locked automatically, every entry secured the moment she arrived home. There was no reason for a door to click. No reason at all. Unless someone was inside. Keanu placed a steady hand on her back, guiding her gently toward the nearest wall. He whispered for her to stay behind him, close enough to move with him, but far enough not to be the first thing a stranger might see. She nodded, unable to form words, the fear settling deep in her bones. She trusted him not just because he was calm under pressure, but because he had a way of making people feel safe even when nothing around them felt safe at all. He took a slow step forward, then another, each movement controlled and silent. The phone's flashlight pushed the darkness back only in small circles, leaving most of the house unrevealed. Every few seconds, Keanu paused to listen, tilting his head slightly, searching for any sign, a breath, a footstep, a shift in air. But the house stayed still, too still in a way that felt unnatural. The hallway opened into the living room, and Keanu guided Sandra behind the dining table, a place where she could crouch low and stay hidden if needed. He whispered for her to stay put, but Sandra shook her head, insisting softly that she could not let him face this alone. He stared at her for a long second, torn between admiration and fear for her, and then nodded. He didn't want to leave her, but he needed to keep her safe. They moved together toward the source of the sound, the back of the house, where a side door led into the small garden. Keanu approached the entrance, his steps silent, his breath slow and steady. He reached the door and saw immediately that the lock was unlatched. Sandra covered her mouth, trying not to gasp. The metal latch hung loosely, swaying slightly as if someone had touched it only moments before. Keanu touched it gently. The metal was still warm. He whispered that whoever opened the door had not gone far. Sandra's knees weakened. All the memories she had spent years burying surged back, overwhelming her with a wave of fear and shame she had not expected to feel again. Keanu noticed her trembling and placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her, grounding her. He told her again that they would face this together. He scanned the garden through the door's narrow window. The night outside was quiet, too quiet. The usual hum of distant cars, the occasional bark of a dog, even the soft rustle of leaves, all of it seemed muted. The garden lights which should have illuminated the walkway were dark. The shadows stretched long and deep. Keanu stepped back inside, closing the door carefully but leaving the latch unfastened in case they needed to move quickly. Then Sandra's phone buzzed again. The sound was so sharp in the silence that it made both of them flinch. She pulled it from her pocket with trembling hands. Keanu leaned close, the light of his phone illuminating the screen. Another message. Same unknown number. You shouldn't look for me. I'm already closer than you think. Sandra's breath hitched. Her fingers curled around the phone as if holding it any looser would cause it to drop. Keanu took the device from her gently, reading the message twice, his expression darkening with each passing second. He turned slowly, scanning the house again, then the windows, the shadows, the corners of the room. And then he froze. Because something was different. Sandra's house had a small hallway mirror near the back entrance. It was large enough to reflect part of the living room and the far end of the hallway. Earlier, when they walked past it, it had reflected only the darkness. Now it reflected something else. A faint shape too tall to be Sandra, too broad to be a trick of the light. A silhouette, standing in the far corner of the living room. Facing them. Keanu tightened his grip on the phone, his heart pounding, but his voice stayed steady when he whispered for Sandra to stay exactly where she was. She turned toward him slowly, sensing the shift in his breathing, the tension in his posture. She asked in a shaky whisper what he saw. He didn't answer. Instead, he motioned for her to crouch lower, shielding her with his body as he took a step toward the center of the room. His eyes stayed locked on the mirror's reflection, following the faint outline that seemed almost unmoving, almost. And then, as he took another small step forward, the silhouette shifted. Not much. Just enough to confirm it was real. Just enough to confirm someone was inside the house with them. Sandra's hand flew to her mouth to hold back a scream. Keanu raised his free hand quietly, signaling for her to stay calm, to stay low, to trust him. He moved another step closer, trying to see the reflection more clearly. And then, the silhouette moved again. Not backward, not sideways, but forward. Toward them. Keanu exhaled slowly, muscles tensing, preparing to step between Sandra and the danger approaching in the dark. But before he could take another step, the house filled with a sudden, blinding flash of light, not from the power returning, but from a camera outside the window. One single burst. White, sharp, directed at Sandra's living room. A picture taken, and someone outside watching the flash outside the window burned through the darkness like lightning, sharp and intrusive, illuminating the living room for a split second. In that brief moment, the silhouette reflected in the hallway mirror vanished, not because it had never been there, but because whoever it was had moved with unsettling ease the moment the light struck the glass. Sandra gasped and gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. Keanu turned toward the window, his phone's flashlight pointed forward like a small, trembling beacon. For a few seconds, everything went still again. The flash left a faint glow lingering behind their eyes, making the shadows seem even darker. Keanu stepped closer to the nearest window, slowly, deliberately, not wanting to provoke whoever was watching from outside. Sandra whispered his name, begging him quietly not to get too close. But he reassured her with calm, steady words. He wasn't putting himself in danger. He just needed to know where the threat was coming from. He reached the window and angled his light outward. The beam caught the reflection of the glass, then pushed past it, illuminating the garden. For a moment, nothing appeared, just the still night, the heavy silence, the outline of the fence. But then, near the bushes at the far end of the yard, Keanu noticed something on the ground. A small rectangle glinting faintly. He recognized the shape immediately. A camera. Sandra, still crouched behind the table, let out a soft, broken whisper when she saw it too. She felt sick to her stomach, the idea that someone had been so close, close enough to take pictures, close enough to watch every movement inside her home. Keanu stepped back from the window, his expression shifting from worry to something sharper, something fiercely protective. Then the room's silence was broken by a soft vibration. Sandra's phone. Another message. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she picked it up. Keanu moved beside her so she wouldn't have to face it alone. She opened the message. You forgot what you promised. Tomorrow you tell the truth. She stared at the words, her breath coming in shallow bursts. But then something in her expression changed, not fear, not panic, but something steadier, something stronger. She whispered that she had never made any promise. She had only tried to leave behind a part of her life that hurt her. She told Keanu that the person behind these messages was twisting the past into a threat. And then, with a sudden calm that surprised even her, she said she was done running. Keanu nodded, recognizing the shift in her voice. Sandra had reached the point where fear stopped pushing her back and started pushing her forward. He told her they would call the police immediately, that they would report everything, the note, the calls, the blackout, the silhouette, the camera. She hesitated only for a moment before agreeing. She realized she had tried to shoulder the past alone for too long. This time, she needed support. Keanu dialed emergency services, his voice clear and steady as he explained the situation. Within minutes, they were told officers were on their way. Relief washed over Sandra, not because everything was resolved, but because she was no longer facing it in silence. She sank onto the sofa, hands still trembling but her breathing becoming steadier. While they waited, Keanu stayed close, watching every shadow, listening to every sound. Sandra leaned into him, letting the comfort of his presence soften the weight she carried. She felt safe for the first time in hours, even as fear lingered around them like fog. When the officers arrived, they searched the house thoroughly. There was no intruder inside, no forced entry, no broken locks, nothing except the warm latch on the back door and the camera in the yard, evidence that someone had been watching, waiting, hiding. The officers listened carefully to every detail Sandra shared. They assured her they would increase patrols in the neighborhood, assign detectives to investigate, and trace the number that had been contacting her. For the first time since the blackout, light returned not from the electricity, but from the officers, flashlights cutting through the darkness with controlled confidence. After they finished their inspection, one of them restored the main power switch outside, and the house brightened with a sudden flare of warm light. Sandra blinked against the brightness, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. She hadn't realized how deeply the darkness had settled into her chest until it lifted. After the officers left, Sandra and Keanu sat on the sofa, exhausted. The night outside was still, but now it felt watched over, guarded. Sandra leaned her head against Keanu's shoulder, letting out a long breath she had been holding for too long. She whispered that she never wanted her past to become a threat again. She never wanted fear to have power over her life. Keanu wrapped an arm gently around her, his voice soft and steady. He told her she had nothing to be ashamed of. She had survived something painful. She had protected herself. She had built a life full of kindness and integrity. And whatever story the caller was trying to twist, it didn't define her. The truth she needed to face wasn't the truth he wanted. It was the truth she had already lived, grown from, and moved beyond. She looked up at him, her eyes still wet but brighter now. She whispered thank you not out of obligation, but out of genuine gratitude. Gratitude for his patience, his steadiness, his refusal to walk away when things became heavy. In her voice was something deeper, something that made Keanu's heart tighten in a way he couldn't hide. She said she didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew she wouldn't face it alone. Keanu smiled softly, the kind of smile that held both strength and tenderness. He promised her they would handle everything together, step by step, truth by truth, fear by fear, until the past lost its power over her for good. And then, with the house finally lit again, and the night no longer pressing in, Sandra took a slow, steady breath and said the words she had been holding back for far too long. I trust you. It was simple, quiet, but to Keanu, it felt like the beginning of something new, not just the end of a frightening night, but the start of a deeper truth between them. Something honest, something strong, something neither of them had dared to speak aloud until now. The past had returned, yes, but so had her courage. And with Keanu beside her, she finally felt ready to face whatever came next.